Hello and welcome to Western Civ. On today's bonus author interview, I'm going to sit down with Nicholas Morton, a historian and author of the recent work, The Mongol Storm, available now. The link is in the show notes if you're interested in picking up a copy. It is, as I mentioned in the interview, probably the best one-off Mongol history book that is on the market right now. And what I mean by that is, if you want to pick up one book only to cover hundreds and thousands of square miles and hundreds of years of history, so we're talking a lot here, this is the book to buy. Covers everything from the origins of the Mongol Empire to its breakup, all the way through Pax Mongolica and down to the very end of the Ilkhanate, and of course everyone's favorite, Golden Horde. Now, before we get into the interview, I give all the quick disclaimers I always do. This is the interview. It is not a normal show. As a result, we are having a conversation and the audio quality is different because we are using a different kind of technology. That being said, it's a lovely interview and I hope you enjoy it. All right, so the first question that I have is sort of a framing question, I suppose I would say. You talk about the clash of culture that takes place as a result of the Mongol invasions. I was struck by that when I was reading the beginning of the book, simply because in many cases, something like the Crusades are referred to as a major clash of culture. And I'm wondering if that's right. Are we defining these terms correctly? Do we use them too broadly? And if we do want to talk about a clash of culture, certainly wouldn't the Mongols coming from far east to west be considered a more appropriate example?
Sure. Well, when we think of a clash of cultures or a clash of civilizations, we tend to think of sort of two very different cultures going head to head. I think you're right to be suspicious of that term because it is more complicated, I think. So in this period, so roughly sort of year 1000 through to about 1300, the Near East suffers from three really big external invasions. The first is the Seljuk Turks moving out of Central Asia and then sweeping into Persia and then what today would be Iraq and into Syria. Then you've got the Crusaders coming from Western Christendom, advancing across Anatolia and then conquering parts of the shoreline of the Levant and then down to Jerusalem. And then the Mongols. And all those invasions, to some extent or other, have been captioned as some kind of clash, but I think there are much more complex processes at work. I mean, to take the Crusades as an example, the Crusades are often captioned as this sort of head-to-head conflict between two rival religions, but in fact it's so much more complicated than that. You do have examples of interfaith hatred and killings and massacres, but you've also got lots of other interesting things going on as well. Expressions of admiration, moments of cooperation, and times when people work together and trade together. So it's a lot more complicated. Now, with the Mongols, it's a different situation again. The Mongols are moving out of Central Asia and seeking to conquer the civilizations around their periphery, whether that's China or the Near East or Western Eurasia or other parts of the world. And as far as they're concerned, they are on a mission to conquer the world. And that is a mission that they believe they have received as a mandate from the eternal heaven. And when they invade the Near East, yes, in some ways they are crossing a sort of traditional boundary where sort of nomadic civilization meets agricultural civilization. But as I mentioned, there is this previous invasion by the Seljuk Turks, who are also a predominantly nomadic people, and by the time the Mongols have invaded, the Seljuks themselves have acquired many agricultural practices. But in some ways, the Mongols are not the first to do this. They're invading a region that has already been conquered 150, 200 years previously by the Seljuk Turks. So many of their opponents, many of the people they overthrow, are actually not so very different to themselves in their culture, even in their way of life in some respects. So I suppose the simple way of putting it would be, it's messy.
Oh, it's certainly messy. And as any listeners of the podcast who've listened to the Crusade episodes know, that to describe the Crusades as, Christians versus Muslims is to oversimplify it to a point that it's no longer accurate, frankly. You have a lot of Christian kingdoms who will ally themselves with different Muslim faiths. And of course, Muslim is not a uniform term either. There are Sunni and Shi'i Muslims within that who don't significantly get along for significant periods of time. But I want to go off the Seljuk Turk line that you brought up in the past, because if I mention the Seljuk Turks, if I mention to an extent the Huns, who are also steppe peoples, some people may have heard of those, but everybody knows Genghis Khan and the Mongols. I'm interested to know why the Mongols were so much more successful. They're all, steppe archers to a large extent. So why were the Mongols so much more successful in stitching together this world empire than some of the other steppe peoples that have come before them?
Yes, indeed. Seljuk Turks is a good example, and they conquered much of the Near East in the 11th century. But you're right, the Mongol Empire was so much broader, so much wider. Territorially, it was many times larger. So what's the difference? And there's several factors here. There's such a strong sense of purpose in what the Mongols are doing. Now, people have said that they've seen, that they sort of feel that there is a world-conquering agenda among the Seljuk Turks, but it's so much clearer and so much more powerful, I think, with the Mongols. They really do think they are going to conquer the world. And for many years, it doesn't seem that implausible in that goal, seeing as they've conquered so much territory. And so there is a moment where the initial conquests begin to gather momentum. They become accustomed to victory. Their troops are getting that much more experienced, and quite honestly, many of their opponents' armies are backing away from the battlefield even before the Mongol armies come into sight, because they suspect they're going to lose. So there is a quality of momentum here which needs to be taken seriously. But there are also things that the Mongols do which make them that much more powerful. Now, all military commanders will generally try and learn, certainly the successful ones, and pick up new things as they go. But the Mongols are very self-conscious about that. And so when they conquered parts of China, for example, they were very careful to make sure that they incorporated into their army people like siege engineers, people with specialisms that they lacked but could make use of. And so that added an additional cutting edge to their military, and they kept adapting. When they saw something they liked, they would then incorporate it into what they were doing. And so that's another string to their bow. Another dimension is they tended to amalgamate people. So when they conquered a civilization, often they would take the warrior groups from that civilization and then break them up into small groups and then incorporate them into the Mongol Empire and then expect them to live, act and fight as Mongols. So the more they conquered, the bigger their armies got. And these are all innovations which set them up for what would become a huge conquest across much of Eurasia.
Yeah, I think that those are good points, and it's interesting that, like, people always want to talk about tactics and military technology and things to that nature, and what sets an army apart from another. But the great conquerors of the world, I think of somebody like Alexander the Great, they do a good job of trying to, as they move, learn and continue to try to add pieces to their forces that they don't necessarily have. Otherwise, you run into a city with walls, and horse archers can't shoot through walls, so that's the end of the conquest. But the other thing that I'm interested in, from sort of a broad perspective, is sort of the lack of cooperation by local powers when facing this sort of existential threat. Certainly, as the Mongols continue to move west, there are whispers coming in about this conquering force that's coming, but it doesn't seem to me, at least, that the powers in the Near East especially ever sort of turned and put aside their own differences to form a coalition to resist this Mongol advance. I'm curious as to why that was, if you have an answer.
Sure. And the Mongol invasions into the Near East, particularly, are a multi-pronged affair. So there's the first invasion, and that's into the Khwarezmian Empire. And the ruler of the Khwarezmian Empire, his strategy for dealing with the Mongols is not to try and tackle them head on, not to try and face their armies in a direct pitched battle. Instead, he separates his forces amongst his major fortress cities and hopes to last out their assault. And this doesn't work because the Mongols just take down his cities one by one, whilst their various sort of companies of horsemen fan out across the countryside and secure those areas as well. After the Khwarezmian Empire, the first force to go further into the Near East is a force led by two commanders called Jebi and Subutai, and they're in pursuit of the Khwarezmian Sultan, who they never actually find. But in the process of chasing him, they go round sort of the circumference of the Caspian Sea, and they destroy field army after field army that's sent against them. They don't really stop to conquer much territory, or they may try and demand submission to Mongol rule, but they don't try and consolidate that. Their goal is to try and capture the Sultan, which they don't actually do. But that first assault is important because so many field armies are defeated, and of course it spreads the aura of fear about the Mongol army and its future advance. The next really big assault comes in the 1230s, and by this time much of the Khwarezmian Empire, particularly its central and eastern districts, is gone. And it's the son of the former Khwarezmian Sultan who takes charge of the defense of its western districts. And his name is Jalal al-Din. Now, what's interesting about Jalal al-Din is he's a very competent commander, but he aggressively expands in the Near East, in the regions not touched by the Mongols. And his goal seems to be to try and create a power block big enough to face the Mongols, so when the Mongols invade next, he can meet them on reasonably equal terms. And when the Mongols do invade in 1229, he does defeat them in battle, at least briefly. So Jalal al-Din is trying to sort of put this power block together, but he's not trying to do it cooperatively. He wants to do it himself. Many of the regional powers learn to fear him, and they begin to resist him. And so in 1230, the other really big empires, particularly the Ayyubid Empire, that's the descendants of Saladin, and the Anatolian Seljuks, that's the Turkish Empire in modern-day Turkey, they form an alliance against Jalal al-Din and then defeat him in battle because they've suffered too much from his encroachments on their territory. But of course, the problem with this is that when they do in fact defeat Jalal al-Din, only a few months later the Mongols send their next major invasion army into the region, which then meets what's left of the Khwarezmian Empire after its defeat. The Khwarezmian Empire then collapses, and crucially the Mongols then stop. So what's facilitating them is this infighting. The Khwarezmian Empire trying to put up its defences, but doing so in a way that alienates its other neighbours. The other neighbours then defeat the Khwarezmian Empire, and the Mongols then come in and take what's left of that empire. So it's a convoluted political situation, multiple factions fighting amongst themselves, and the Mongols making their move at the time when they are most vulnerable. And then into the 1240s, the Mongols then advance into the Anatolian Seljuk territory. They do it very quickly, and so then it's a sort of piecemeal breaking up of what's left of the Near East.
And it's a history lesson that is just repeated over and over and over again. You know, it's very consistent that it's much easier to fear the enemy that's already next to you than somebody who might come next to you in the future. Those local rivalries tend to undermine any what could have been, consolidated efforts to resist. And, I do admit, of course, there's a large degree of Monday morning quarterbacking going on here where, they didn't know that the Mongols were going to conquer the world at the time that they were coming. For all they would have known, the Mongols were going to stop at some point, or maybe would have been defeated in battle, and then would have had to turn back. So they weren't aware that this was going to occur. But I want to ask about the Khwarizm, the Sultan. He. And by the way, listeners of the show will know that that is a word that I have traditionally struggled with in terms of pronunciation. But he is one of the people, we used to talk about the great man theory of history. Well, there's also, if there's great men, there's also, like they say, there's the great idiots of history. He makes one of those epically foolish decisions to essentially insult the Mongols and invite them in. How badly does he manage to miscalculate this situation here?
Okay, so that's a good question. The narrative goes that the Mongols sent a trading caravan to the frontier town of Utra on the borders of the Khwarezmian Empire. Ostensibly, this caravan was designed to be a gesture of peace, but that's not what happened. The caravan and the personnel associated with the caravan were arrested and then put to death, with just one survivor who then made it back to the Mongols, who then staged their invasion into the Khwarezmian Empire. And so you're quite right. But that raises the question of why. What were they thinking? Why would they provoke Eurasia's fastest growing empire in that way? And it's a very difficult question to ask. And the sources from this period don't necessarily help us that much. They don't give us many clues, except that we know that the members of the caravan were arrested and then subsequently executed. So, in some respects, you could explain this in terms of local events. Perhaps there was an outbreak of disputation between the Mongol merchants and the local authorities, which then spiraled. Maybe you could explain it that way. I do wonder, however, if somewhere in the Khwarezmians' thinking is the fear that this caravan was not a merchant caravan at all. It was a reconnaissance expedition and should be treated as such, and that they considered themselves really to be at war with the Mongols anyway, or at least they felt it was coming, so they should make the first move. But that's just me guessing.
Right, and we'll never know unless, in future generations more evidence is uncovered. But it always strikes me as, sometimes people just make the wrong decision. I mean, it's not always the case that there are large factors at play. Somebody may have just messed up, and maybe they did. But the Khwarezmians are interesting too, and I think that they show the interconnectedness of kingdoms back then, right? Because they end up moving towards the kingdom of Jerusalem, isn't that right?
Yes. I mean, the Mongol conquests are important for the civilizations and societies and communities they overthrew, but they also set a lot of people into motion. There's a lot of people trying to get out of the way, and a large number of Khwarezmians moved west to try and get away from the fighting, and of course they're bringing news with them. And it's not clear to the various powers of the Near East whether that's the Kingdom of Jerusalem or the other Crusader states or the Ayyubid Empire in Egypt and Syria. It's not clear to these sorts of powers exactly who they're dealing with, at least initially. And in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, there is some speculation that this distant report of an army advancing towards them is not actually the Mongols. That's a word that comes up a lot later. Their theory, at least initially, is that these are the armies of Prester John. And Prester John is a mythical ruler who was believed in Western Christendom to live somewhere out to the east. And he was believed to be the king or priest, king or emperor, according to various different accounts, who ruled a Christian kingdom populated by monsters. And so they actually believe, and it seems to have been taken quite seriously by many people, that these reports of the Mongols were actually reports of Prester John on the march. And so some people speculated that actually these reports and this idea of this Prester John advancing west, that these forces were allied to them, that these were friendly forces marching to their aid. And so this actually began to influence their foreign policy, as you might say, and their understanding of the world for many years, until it became perfectly clear this is not the case. But it is an interesting dimension that the Khwarezmians and other people trying to get out of the way of the Mongols set off these, triggered these rumours, triggered these ideas, in the peoples they met on the way. But another really big impact of the Khwarezmians is that whilst they were trying to move west to get away from the Mongols and their advancing forces, their numbers still contained a large number of fighters, and these fighters were prepared to offer themselves to service. And in doing so, offering themselves to the Anatolian Seljuks, as I mentioned, that's the Sultanate that occupied much of what would be modern-day Turkey, later on the Ayyubids in Egypt, they began to unbalance the power relationships in the Near East, and where people had been sort of reasonably evenly balanced previously, the addition of Khwarezmian auxiliaries suddenly gave one power the upper hand over the other. A major battle in that regard is called Laforbi in 1244, where the Khwarezmians allied themselves against one Ayyubid faction in Egypt to fight against another Ayyubid faction based in Damascus, and the Damascene faction was allied to the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And that resulted in a major battle at Laforbi, which resulted in a defeat for the Damascenes and the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which ultimately sent the Kingdom of Jerusalem into decline, into long-term decline, or at least it was one of the factors in doing that.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because, sometimes we try, you'll read like a region-specific history of some sort, and I always find that those are difficult to do because societies and civilizations are so interconnected that actions hundreds, if not thousands of miles distant can easily impact a civilization close to home. It's not maybe a direct impact, but the indirect impact can be just as palatable on that civilization. And by the way, Prester John has got to be one of my favorite all-time characters from European history from this time. I mean, he's almost like the combo. I guess I would call him like a Santa Claus / Superman that the Christians keep hoping is just gonna show up and save everything. And he's around for a long time. Listeners of the show remember, Henry the Navigator still thinks he's maybe gonna stumble on this guy's kingdom well into the 15th century. Unfortunately, we're still kicking around for this Prester John character. Bad news, he doesn't exist. But I wanted to come back. You talked a while ago about how the Mongols were successful at sort of incorporating new peoples, amalgamating them into their civilization, into their sprawling worldwide empire. And one of the ways that they're often taught as doing this is by being the sort of first, I'm putting this in air quotes, religiously tolerant civilizations in the world. They're sort of infamous. I've read a number of books that talk extensively about this, but I wonder to what extent this is this true, and how did this impact the growth of the Mongol Empire?
Sure. Well, I don't think it necessarily eased their conquest. I don't think people sort of were more willing to reconcile themselves to overthrow because they felt that this was going to be a more tolerant society that was going to be created as a result. But certainly is a very distinctive quality of Mongol civilization. The way it basically worked is that the Mongols, they believed in the eternal heaven, which isn't quite the same thing as a god, but it's a sort of spiritual power. And they believed they had a mandate from the eternal heaven to rule the planet. Now, in approaching it from that way of thinking, all other religions are part of that vision. In the sense, the Mongols don't believe that any of the world's religions are necessarily wrong, but they are regional manifestations of the broader spiritual power to which they themselves adhere. And so there's no particular contradiction, or there's no seeming contradiction necessarily for a Mongol leader to seek the spiritual support simultaneously of multiple faiths, whether that's Christians or Muslims or Buddhists or other religions, because ultimately they are all deemed to have spiritual power of their own kind. But they are still subordinate to the Mongols' own spiritual mandate for global authority. So it's tolerance of a kind. They are all equal in the sense that they are all within the broader sense of the Mongol Imperium. Now, some people found this new environment very positive, because they may have been persecuted previously. Now they're not. They're now on a level footing with their former persecutors. Some peoples move around into territories they hadn't been in before. So there's the movement of Buddhist communities into the Near East, for example, which previously hadn't had much of a presence in the region. You've also got Muslim commentators saying that parts of Central Eurasia are now open to Islam in a way they hadn't been previously. So there are dynamics within this as well. But for my money, one of the things that makes this such a fascinating period and makes this whole business of the Mongols' approach to religions so interesting is that because all the religions in the Mongol Empire were treated on equal footing or a reasonably equal footing, what you've got is the representatives of those religions going to the Mongols to try and win their favour. There's a sort of a rush to try and win over the Mongols' favour, or even better, to convert them. The Mongols aren't easy to convert because, as far as they're concerned, their own views encompass other religions' views, but that doesn't stop other religions from trying. And they come up with all sorts of ways to try and convince the Mongols to either support their people or support their view or join their religion. And so you've got this weird sort of contest in the Mongols' enormous wagon cities, thousands of wagons. And at the centre of this, the big tents of the Khan and his leading lieutenants. And in these tents, you've got these debates that play out as the Mongols hear and weigh the religious arguments and views being put forward by the various advocates of the different religions within their empire.
Yeah, I find that part interesting because, there is a point where especially the Christians will say, okay, this isn't Priester John. Can we make him Priester John? Is there a way to turn this around to make this worldwide empire a superpower Christian? And also to an extent, we have to remember that we can't look at it always through the Western lens of Christianity. The Mongols, as you point out, they weren't necessarily as adversarial with their religious perspectives as, say, Christianity or Muslim, which are exclusive. You either are or you aren't. Whereas, the Mongols to me sound a lot more like the Achaemenid Persians at times, where it was sort of like, yeah, okay, we'll honor the gods in this city and this city and this city. Doesn't really matter. It's all the same to us anyway. Just do me a favor and pay your taxes. But the Mongol Empire crucially starts to break apart in the 1260s. And so how does that happen, and how does that start to affect the relationship between the Mongols and their various adversaries?
Yeah, so this is one of the really big processes that not only leads to the breakup of the Mongol Empire, but slows down or even stops their wars of conquest as their armies turn on themselves. And there's various factors underpinning this. One is that by the time we get to sort of the 1260s, the Mongol Empire stretches from the Pacific seaboard all the way to the borders of Poland and Hungary. It's vast. The Mongols have control by this stage over much of the Near East, except for the sort of the coastal regions and parts of Western Syria. The empire is enormous, and of course they're trying to manage this empire without all the modern communication technologies that we have today. They do have some very sophisticated communications networks, not least the fast horse system. So the idea being, if you want to get a message to travel over vast distances, you have good roads and then way stations on those roads where riders will carry a message 30, 40, 50 miles, put it into the hands of the next messenger, who will then set off in a fast horse. And so you can carry messages over a great distance. But even so, it's thousands of miles wide. And coordinating that kind of empire is difficult. Now, within that, the empire itself, whilst, yes, you have the Great Khan, who is the overall ruler, large parts of that empire were divided into ulu, which are specific areas designated for the various children of Genghis Khan. And they then rule those areas theoretically in the name of the Great Khan. In practice, they often run them more or less as they want. But that raises the question, where are the boundaries of those? Where's the boundaries of each of these sorts of royal domains? And the big question here, particularly on the western borders, is where's that boundary in the Near East? Because one family, called the Jochid dynasty, they believe they have a right to the entire western wing of the Mongol Empire. But then from from 1256 to 1260, a new Mongol army sets out to the Near East, and this is the army which in 1258 brings about the devastating overthrow of Baghdad, led by a ruler called Hulagu, and he essentially claims the region for himself. And this enrages the Jochid ruler, and Hulagu refuses to sort of submit to his authority, and so you've got a war that begins to develop between the Jochid ruler, Burke, ultimately, and then Hulagu in the Near East itself. They both feel they have a claim to the region, but neither's backing down. And so suddenly, where Hulagu's army was conducting a war of expansion in the Near East, and where the northern wing of the Jochid dynasty in Western Eurasia was conducting a war of expansion towards places like Hungary and Poland, suddenly they stop those wars of expansion and they turn on each other, and there is a massive and prolonged conflict in the Caucasus region as these two wings of the empire, which would become known as the Golden Horde in Western Eurasia and the Ilkhanate in the Near East, they turn on each other and begin to wage a protracted conflict. And the outcome of this is where the Golden Horde, the Jochid dynasty in Western Eurasia, had been planning a new massive offensive into what would today be Eastern Europe. That never happens. There's a few raids, there's a few attacks in later years, but there's no big invasion of Western Christendom at all. So suddenly that invasion is averted due to this civil war. And likewise in the south, Hulagu can never really focus on defeating his remaining enemies in the Near East, because he's much more concerned about his Mongol rival to the north.
Yeah, it's interesting, and it's an interesting what if about, what happens if those invasions do go forward. How far are the Mongols able to penetrate? I mean, certainly previous steppe people, the Huns had gone all the way through, what is today France, down all the way to the gates of Rome. So we know that it could happen. The question is, how far would they have pushed it? But one place where the Mongols, the one group, external group, I mean, because they fight against each other and that slows them down. But one external group who's finally able to, I guess, stand against them to some extent are the Mamluks, ultimately. And they fight the battle, and I'll probably get this wrong, of Ain Jalut, but I'm curious as to how significant that battle was, who was involved, and why were the Mamluks successful, whereas everybody else, just from China all the way through to the Caliphate, couldn't do it? Why were they successful in making a stand?
Yeah, great question. So the Mongols are not unbroken in their record of military victories. Every now and again, they get a military setback, but it's always temporary. A setback's normally followed by a sort of an avalanche of additional attacks to make sure that that defeat is well and truly forgotten as fast as possible. But you're right, the Mamluk Empire is able to defeat the Mongols, and between 1260, the Battle of Ain Jalut, all the way up to the Mamluks' first defeat in 1299, which is only temporary, the Mamluks do prove able to hold their borders against the Mongols in a way that people hadn't been able to do previously. And this raises the question of why. One of the ways I answer this is looking back through the writings of a Franciscan friar called John of Plano Carpini. And he went to visit the Mongols in the 1240s, and when he came back, he was asked, how can anyone defeat the Mongol armies? And he said, the only way you can do it is with an army which is essentially the same. A typically agricultural society fighting in an agricultural society's normal manner just won't cut it. To defeat a nomadic steppe army, you need a nomadic steppe army. And what's interesting about the Mamluks is that their armies are in fact organised very similar, on a very similar lines to the Mongols themselves. So in a sense, he was right. And the Mamluks themselves, they're a very interesting dynasty. They arose in Egypt in 1250, when they were formerly slave soldiers fighting for the Ayyubid Sultanate, but they rose up, overthrew the sultans, and took power for themselves. And so in the 1260s, they're still quite a young power. They've only been around for about 10 years. But they're determined to fight. They're going to defeat the Mongols, and as a tender of that, the Mamluk Sultan called Sultan Qutuz. When the Mongols send envoys demanding his submission, they famously execute some and shave the beards from the other, which of course is an enormous insult. It's clear it's now there's nothing else but war now. So when the Mongols advance into Syria in 1260, they take Aleppo with a very brutal siege, and then a flying column goes down and conquers Damascus. The Mamluks at this point are in Egypt. The Mongols are carrying all before them. The Mamluks then advance with quite a small army, probably no more than about 12,000 troops, against the Mongols. And the Mongol army at this point is about 100,000 strong. So this is an exceptionally gutsy move. And in fact, when the Mamluks say to the Kingdom of Jerusalem, "Do you want to support us?" the Kingdom of Jerusalem says, essentially, "Well, we'll give you supplies and some spare horses, but you carry on." I think the Kingdom of Jerusalem's position is really it wants to sort of hedge its bets. It wants to keep a diplomatic channel open with the Mongols, but neither does it want to alienate the Mamluks either. It tries to sort of play both sides. So either way, the Mamluks advance on the Mongols unassisted by anyone. But fortunately for the Mamluks, they get a break, which is that the Great Khan in Mongolia dies, and so a large proportion of the Mongol invasion force withdraws east towards the Caucasus. And it's only a garrison that's left in Syria to hold the area, and that garrison is probably about 12,000 to 20,000 strong, so not much larger than the Mamluks' army itself. And so when the Mamluks advance, they do in fact meet an army which isn't substantially superior to their own, and they are able to defeat that army in battle. But of course, that raises all sorts of questions. Yes, it's a victory. No, the Mongols are not accustomed to being defeated. But the bulk of the Mongol army still remains unfought. So for the next 20 years, the big question is, when are the Mongols going to return in force? And the Mamluks spent that 20-year period reinforcing and fortifying their position, trying to build up their empire to a condition where it can withstand a full-scale Mongol invasion. But the event that really plays out in their favour is that it is in this period that the big civil war in the Mongol Empire breaks out. And so where previously the Mongols might have returned in force very quickly, actually they're so preoccupied by their own internal struggles they can't do that for 20 years. And when the Mongols do return in 1280, and the big battle's fought in 1281, the Mamluks are ready for them, and the Mamluks are able to defeat their full field army this time at the Battle of Homs.
Yeah, and it's another really interesting historical what if, because if the Mongols are able to overcome the Mamluks and conquer Egypt, there is nothing stopping them from rolling across North Africa at that point. I mean, and then from there, it becomes a question of how much further are they able to push it. So it's another one of those sort of checkpoints of someone is able to stand just enough and get just enough of a break, and that happens repeatedly in history. But kind of turning to that civil war for a moment here, the Mongol Empire, the Mongol ruler Kublai Khan, the Samuel Taylor Coleridge guy, he's famous for a lot more than just the poem, but he ultimately divides the empire. And how does that division sort of change how the Mongols approach their conquests and their borders from now on?
Sure. The Mongol Empire's breakup, yes, you're right, it takes place as a result of sort of internal disputes in the core territories of the Mongol Empire. Also takes place on the frontiers as well. Kublai is able to conquer much of what's left of Song China, so the conquests do continue a bit on that front. But what the Mongols are coming up against increasingly is that whilst they can conquer much of the sort of central steppe region of Eurasia and much of its peripheral region reasonably easily, they find it increasingly difficult to penetrate regions which aren't suitable for a nomadic way of life. Their civilizations are centered on huge wagon cities, thousands of wagons, and then herds of millions of animals. But those animals need grazing, they need fodder. And whilst that's possible where there's a reasonably high rainfall and when it's not too mountainous, that becomes increasingly difficult as you begin to reach the sort of the desert margins in the Near East, or indeed when you hit the jungle regions in Southeast Asia. And so there are, if you like, natural limits to Mongol expansion. Now, we don't know how serious those obstacles were, whether there were other factors that stopped the Mongols in those areas. But it is an interesting question. How far can the Mongol Empire really expand if it needs to bring those flocks and herds and those big wagon cities with them? Because that's just not suitable for environments such as dense jungle, thick deciduous forest, or indeed desert, where the Mongols struggled a great deal more.
Yeah, and it does seem like oftentimes, whatever, depending on whatever empire you're talking about throughout history, there are sort of geographic limits because there's a reason that certain empires were able to dominate these regions. I often think of the Romans are one of the go-to empires. The legions are dominant in Europe where the battlefields are set up for them. They struggle when they have to face off against horse archers in the Near East, which are set up for them. And so there's sort of this natural, almost boundary of sort of home field advantage based off of what it is that you're trying to do. But so we then kind of entered this sort of new phase of the Mongol Empire where it's broken up into different divisions, and by and large, the age of big sweeping conquests have come to an end. And we enter, what a lot of historians, at least what I've seen in a lot of books, refer to as the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace, a time when there's trade. And in the book you write, and this is a quotation, it said, in the short term at least, the disruption brought by the Mongol invasions, as well as other wars of this period, naturally created an adverse environment for trade. Yet in the long term, the Mongol rulers themselves energetically supported commerce across their colossal empire. Very correct, but I'm just curious as to how they did that.
Sure. Well, the first thing to be acknowledged is that the Mongol conquest, the invasion period themselves, was obviously enormously disruptive. Merchants and traders simply won't travel if through a war zone, and with the enormous loss of life, particularly in some of the bigger cities, which resulted from the Mongol conquests, that will necessarily have an adverse economic effect. But yes, the Mongols, they were very interested in trade. They were always interested in trade. And so often you get Mongol leaders acting as patrons for individual merchants. And you're right, there is this question of how did the establishment of this vast empire affect international trade? Because suddenly you get merchants and travelers and people traveling for other purposes, such as missionaries or explorers, crossing enormous distances in a way they hadn't done previously. And so that raises the question, did the Mongol Empire create suddenly this massive free trade zone where people could travel in a way they couldn't do previously? And the answer to that is that in some cases that seems to be the case. And certainly there were travelers who could reach places that their societies never even heard of before, in a way they couldn't have previously when the whole sort of Eurasian region was divided between all sorts of smaller empires and communications were less easy. On the other hand, it's not simply the case that the Mongol Empire, once established, was simply a single unitary empire. It does break up. There are civil wars. There are rebellions. There are usurpations. There is conflict. It's not simply one vast free trade zone. And quickly, as the empire breaks up, that sense that you can travel very easily from one end to the other, that disappears fairly quickly. So it is mixed in its economic effects, but I think one of the economic effects that I find particularly interesting is not its impact on existing trade routes, but the way the Mongol Empire reroutes the trade across the entire region. Because what the Mongols have done by conquering so many civilizations is they have taken the assets of those kingdoms, sultanates, empires, and they've melted them down, basically. They've turned them from items that were deemed to be exceptionally symbolically important to those civilizations. Now they're liquid cash, and they want to spend. And so what you've got is this new economy that forms around the Mongols' vast encampments, where merchants are flocking to them because the Mongols have such enormous piles of cash and wealth that naturally the merchants want to trade. And this affects all sorts of commodities. And obviously the things that are most in demand are the things the Mongols want. And one of the stories that I find particularly interesting, I'm not sure how strictly speaking true it is, but it makes this point about changing economics, is the trade in owl feathers. The story goes like this, that there is a legend that when the Mongols initially wanted to expand their empire, they could only expand through a narrow slip of land in which there was a ruined fortress. Whenever they went near this ruined fortress, this terrible cry went up, which they thought was indicative of evil spirits in the ruins, so they backed off. But then one day, a warrior who was hunting with his dogs, by accident went into this ruined castle and realized this cry was not actually a terrible being, but actually an owl. And so as a result, the owl became a symbol of good luck and a symbol of the Mongols, therefore their later wars of expansion into the wider world. And so as a result, people began to decorate their clothing and headgear with owl feathers. Now, in economic terms, suddenly you have a very lucrative market for owl feathers. And so the report that describes this says that you've actually got the mass depopulation of owls as people go out to find these owls so they can gather and sell the feathers to the Mongols, because the Mongols have got the cash. And if you've got the cash, the markets will realign themselves to fit your desires.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And again, it's one of those things that you see throughout history that, especially in pre-modern history, sure, there are new gold and silver mines being produced, but we're also kind of just moving around existing wealth a lot. In the pre-modern age, somebody gets conquered and all of their gold stuff gets melted down and turned into this new person's gold stuff, and so on and so forth, and so it repeats. And speaking of falling empires, one of the really interesting parts in the book that I really enjoyed was close to the tail end, when it talks. And by the way, it's a sweeping book, and the listeners should be aware. I've already recommended it, but the listeners should be aware that it's certainly the best book that covers all of the Mongol period. It was very, very difficult to do because you're talking about hundreds of thousands of square miles and hundreds of years. So it's a huge undertaking that you do very well. And I don't think I was trying to go back and look through some of the other books that I've used in the past, and it's just so rare to see the word Byzantium and the word Mongol in sort of the same sentence connected. So I found that connection really, really interesting at the end of the book when you talk about both how the Mongol Empire, and we're talking about the Ilkhanate at this point, how portions of it both supported and then contributed to the final collapse of the Byzantine state, which was, of course, a rump state at that point. But I wondered if you could just talk about that for just a few minutes, because I thought it was so interesting.
Sure. So the major event hanging over the history of the Byzantine Empire at this time is the conquest of Constantinople in 1204 by the armies of the Fourth Crusade. And in the years that followed the Fourth Crusade and its devastating sack of Constantinople was the conquest of much of the former Byzantine Empire by armies of crusaders. But you do have these areas left of the Byzantine Empire that managed to resist the Crusader advance. One of these is what's called the Empire of Nicaea in the western tip of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. And the Empire of Nicaea clings on despite the rise of the what will become known as the Latin Empire of Constantinople, which is the empire erected by the Crusaders after the Fourth Crusade. And so you've got the Crusaders in the north trying to push down and conquer the Empire of Nicaea. To the east of the Empire of Nicaea, you've got the Anatolian Seljuks, who are actually on broadly reasonable terms with the Empire of Nicaea, but they're still a powerful neighbour. And then above the Crusaders, you've got the Bulgarian Empire, which again is another powerful empire. And so the Byzantines in Nicaea, which is the strongest element of what's left of the Byzantine Empire, it's clinging on. And then the Mongol invasions happen. And in the 1230s, as the Mongols were invading through much of Western Eurasia, the events play out against Byzantine interests because large numbers of displaced people arrive in the kingdom, the Latin Empire of Constantinople, and offer themselves to service, bulking up the Crusaders' armies, which plays against the Empire of Nicaea. But then in the 1240s, the Mongols themselves swing south, cause a substantial defeat to the Latin Empire of Constantinople, and then defeat the Bulgarian Empire as well. And only 2 years later, in 1243, another Mongol empire advances into Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, and defeats the Anatolian Seljuks, but none of them reach the Byzantine Empire. So in those years, 1241 to 1243, inadvertently, the Mongols defeat all the Byzantine's neighbours. And so it's an astonishing reversal of fortune. Of course, none of it's intended by the Mongols. It's a sort of collateral side effect of what they're doing elsewhere. So that may go some way to explaining why the Byzantine Empire in Nicaea was able to recover a little bit of ground in later years. And under the Empire of Nicaea's various leaders, in 1261, it is able to recover Constantinople from the Latin Empire, which it destroys in that year. But there's another side to this as well, which is the Mongols know the Byzantines are there, and like everyone else, they expect the Byzantines to submit to their rule. And so they send various envoys to the Byzantines saying, okay, you're going to be submitting now, thank you very much, or words to that effect. And the Byzantines sort of prevaricate. They don't say yes or no, they try and play the diplomatic game. But in 1257, 1257, the Mongols send envoys to the Byzantines, and they're in earnest this time. They want the Byzantines to submit. So what the Byzantines do, they know they've got a fairly small territory. This is before they retake Constantinople, so their empire is quite small. They know that they're reasonably small, but they want to convince the Mongols that they are in fact very powerful indeed, because it's in their interest to give that kind of impression. So when the Mongol envoys arrive, they're met by various Byzantine diplomats, and those diplomats then take them on the most circuitous route they can possibly imagine around the Empire of Nicaea to give the impression that it's just this enormous empire that takes days to cross. And at every juncture, they station troops everywhere, so it looks as though this empire is huge and very heavily fortified, which again, it may have helped the Byzantines to play the diplomatic game for a bit longer. Ultimately, however, in 1260, the Byzantines do make a treaty with the Mongols. Exactly what that entailed, we're not quite sure. It looks like they submitted. The Byzantines may have tried to couch it in slightly different terms. But of course, as soon as that treaty has been signed, the Mongol Empire itself divides. And so in the Near East, you have the Ilkhanate. And then in the north, to the north of the Black Sea and above the Byzantine Empire, you've got the Golden Horde. And here's the problem. They both expect the Byzantines to be their allies, even though they're at war with each other. And so the Byzantines then begin this period of diplomatic activity where they try to sort of negotiate their position with both. They can't afford to alienate either of them. And they can't afford to take sides. So they try and sort of play a mediating role, keeping in favour with both these Mongol factions, and in doing so, to prolong their own survival, which indeed they do. So the 13th century is a time when the Byzantines play a very, very intelligent diplomatic game to maintain and even expand their position. What causes problems for the Byzantines in this era, though, is that they do face sustained attack from the West, from Western Christendom, who, when Constantinople is reconquered by the Byzantines, they want it back. And then in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, you've got increasingly large numbers of Turkmen groups, who are Turkic peoples displaced by the Mongols who move into Anatolia, and then they begin to press on the Byzantines' borders. And the Byzantines then find it increasingly difficult to deal with that new opponent, which then poses great dangers, not least when it forms an Ottoman Empire and the other Turkmen beyliks of the Near East in later decades.
And it's all connected, and that's the thing that's fascinating. Yep, and it's all connected. They sort of Byzantium gets maybe a little extra reprieve because the Mongol wave manages to hit every other sandcastle except for their sandcastle. And so it stands up a little bit longer, but I mean, how long were they going to play that game for? So as I mentioned, phenomenal book. We talked about a fraction of it, but couldn't recommend it enough. And I truly do hope that it's very successful.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for coming on the show. It's been great.
Thank you so much for having me.